So I have been using the Canon EOS R3 for the last few months now, really ever since it came out back in November. I pre-ordered it and got it on release day, and I've been shooting with it really ever since. And a few of you have noticed that I've been shooting with this camera for some of my YouTube videos. I've shot a few weddings with it, and people have been asking, hey Josh, what do you think about the R3? How does it stack up against the R6, the R5, some other cameras in that lineup? And so today that's what I wanted to do, just give you my honest feedback on what I've liked about this camera, what I've not liked about this camera, and just how I feel it fits into my workflow as a wedding photographer, a wedding filmmaker, and as a YouTuber. And just a little disclaimer before we dive into all the pros and cons and everything, this is not going to be like a super technical video. There's a time and a place for learning all those little details, but I'm of the impression in my photography work and my video work that the technical specs aren't worth arguing about, neither is brand worth arguing about. Every camera and every camera manufacturer has their strengths and has their weaknesses. I've been a Canon guy ever since 2017. It's been great for me. They definitely have some strengths, they have some weaknesses. Canon's not right for everyone. The R3 is not right for everyone. I have friends that shoot on Sony, on Leica, on Fuji, on Olympus, on Nikon. So I know I'm gonna get some comments down below saying like, hey, you should check out the Sony Alpha series, you should check out the Nikon Z. This camera and this brand has worked well for me in my workflow. It might not work for you, but what I wanna do is just honestly share some of my feedback on the R3, how it has kind of slotted itself into my workflow specifically, and then give you some thoughts on how it might fit into your workflow as well, depending on what it is that you actually shoot. So I want to start by talking about some of the specifications that I needed in a camera that I use. And this is not R3 specific, this is just the cameras that I look for. What do I look for when I look for a camera? I'm a wedding photographer, I'm a wedding videographer, and I shoot YouTube videos. And so the type of stuff that I need is photo and video specific. And the way that I shoot photo and video for weddings is I shoot with one camera, I shoot alone, I don't use second shooters or assistants or anything. And so I need a camera that's super fast, that's super powerful, and that will get the job done from both a photo and from a video standpoint. And so a few things I look for in a camera are, I really want a camera that has obviously good image quality, but I specifically want good video quality. Specifically, I want 4K 120 because I shoot a lot of like slow motion stuff on video and I want to have 4K footage. It's up to 120 frames per second. Ideally, I'd like to have the option to record some raw video. I don't shoot a lot of raw video, but having the option to turn that on and off is super nice. Because I'm shooting so much photo and so much video right back to back, I want to make sure I have fast memory card capability and a good buffer within the camera. Along with that, I want to have a fast frame per second shooting for stills. I want to be able to shoot photos very, very quickly. I want to have really, really good autofocus because again, in a fast-paced wedding environment, I need to be able to trust the autofocus system, trust what the camera's gonna do, trust that it's gonna keep things in focus from both a photo and from a video standpoint. And all of that said, I wanna make sure I have good battery life to support all of that so that I'm not having to switch out batteries constantly throughout the wedding day, because a wedding day can be pretty fast-paced at times. And to be able to pop a battery in the camera and trust that it's gonna last me through several hours of intense shooting at the least is super, super important to my workflow and the type of work that I do. So I've been shooting with the Canon R6 for the last year or so. Have shot 25 weddings or so with that and a bunch of other videos as well. It's been a great camera, but it didn't match all those specifications. And so when the R3 got announced, I knew it matched all the specifications that I needed for a video camera and for a photo camera. And so I immediately pre-ordered that camera, was waiting for that to come out. And then in November of 2021, ironically, right after my last job of 2021, that camera showed up on my doorstep. So after November, I shot with the R3 almost exclusively. I want to kind of talk through a few like pros and cons of the R3, beginning with the autofocus system. So the autofocus system on the R3 is honestly insane. I was incredibly impressed with the autofocus system on the R6 and the R5. I shot with both of those cameras extensively last year. Incredible autofocus system, great eye tracking, great subject detection, but the R3 takes that up a whole new level. This camera does an incredibly good job at tracking what you tell it to track, whether that's people, animals, cars. That being said, a massive con of this camera is how good the intelligence is at actually tracking things. I've talked about in my video on custom settings for the R6 how I kind of set up my little multifunction button to switch between that single point focus and like eye tracking. The R3 does not have that option. You can have single point, just a point focus, but there's no like eye tracking option in the actual focusing menus for the R3. All you have is just kind of a big zone automatic focusing system, and then you tell it to track people, focus on the eyes, etc. When I first got this camera, I hated that. I spent most of my time shooting with a single point, and I really honestly didn't like the focusing system. But once I started realizing how intelligent the autofocus system actually is, this camera is amazing. It's funny because with the R6, I used to switch back and forth between like eye detection and single point, eye detection, single point, and I'd kind of do a lot of switching back and forth. With the R3, I find I can typically just leave it on its like person detection with eye focus setting, and it just does what it needs to do almost all the time. There's a few situations where like people are walking away from the camera, or I want to focus on one specific person where I'll switch back to that single point. But I found that literally letting this camera just choose what needs to happen based on the settings that you have set inside of it allows this camera to catch focus almost every single time. And the more I've been actually trusting the autofocus system on the camera, I've ended up getting more photos that are sharp and in focus than I even got on the R6. Pro and con here, but the autofocus system is honestly insane on this camera. I haven't seen anything like it, and I have really begun to enjoy the autofocus system, especially in my last few shoots. So I don't feel like we could talk about a photo camera without talking about the image quality. And honestly, I've been really impressed with the image quality of the R3. The little megapixel boost from the R6 to the R3 was super welcome. I'm not ever a pixel peeper in terms of megapixels. I honestly used the R5 quite a bit last year as well, and didn't like how many megapixels there were in that camera. Even though the photos were incredibly sharp, there was so much data being sent to the card that the card couldn't read as fast as I needed to write to it because I was putting so much data through. And so to kind of scale things back to like a 24 megapixel, it's a little bit of a megapixel boost over the R6. And I found that just in general, I really like the image quality, how the actual sensor renders tones, and that little megapixel boost is a welcome addition from the R6. So I mentioned needing to have a fast memory card option and a good buffer in the camera. That's one of the things the R5 did a good job with having those CF Express cards that read crazy fast. But because of the huge file size on the R5, it just couldn't keep up with the throughput that I needed to do in terms of how many images and how much video I needed to push through. So the R3, with those same memory cards, but a better buffer and just a little bit lower image size, I've found that this camera can keep up with almost the full demand that I want to put through it in terms of photo and video. I find myself shooting a lot of 4K 120 and then immediately switching to photos and holding the shutter to get a huge burst of images, and then switching right back to video, and the camera can keep up with it, the cards can keep up with it. Or the R6 would choke up, I'd have to stop and let the thing buffer for a while because those SD cards are only running at maximum like 300 megabytes per second, versus the CF Express cards in this camera run at almost 1800 megabytes per second, which is literally like 6 times as fast. So having the CF Express card in this camera, a little bit lower resolution than the R5, but better than the R6 was, I found a really happy medium in this camera for my specific workflow. Video capabilities in a camera are huge for me, and I've been very impressed with what I found in the R3. So again, I mentioned I wanted 4K 120. This thing does great 4K 120 video, and a big boost over the R6 is that it actually shoots in the all-eye codec versus IPB, which is just a less compressed format, a little higher quality format compared to the R6. The computer definitely can render the footage better, and I've been very impressed with the videos that have come out of this thing. I've been very happy with how the footage has come together. And that brings me to the battery life. The battery on this thing is the same battery that was in my Canon 1DX Mark II. It's Canon's big LPE19 battery, which is just a lot more battery life than their typical little batteries. And I found that this battery just lasts so much longer. That's one of the things I loved about my 1DX Mark II, was just how good the battery life was. The R6, I found myself bringing batteries constantly to change things out. The R5 even more so. With the R3, I find that the battery lasts a lot of the day, and I only have to change like once, maybe twice with shooting photo and video for a full 10-hour wedding day, versus like 4, 5, even 6 times on the R6 and the R5. So overall thoughts and impressions on the R3, I've been very impressed with it. Image quality is great, video quality is great, autofocus is insane once you actually lean into the kind of AI component of it and just allow it to track the subjects that you tell it to. It does a really good job. The buffer's great, memory cards are great, battery life's incredible. I've been very happy with this for my workflow. But let's talk about your workflow. So who is this camera for? So obviously the R3 is kind of reminiscent of the 1DX series, which was definitely made for sports shooters. R3 is no different. If you're a sports shooter and you want to shoot a lot of high frame rate photos, you want to have some incredible fast autofocus, this camera is fantastic. So if you're shooting sports, there's a reason this camera came out right around the time of the Olympics. It's great for sports. If you're a sports shooter, this is a fantastic camera. If you're a combined photo and video shooter like I am, where you're shooting some photos, some video, but not exclusively one or the other, again, this camera's fantastic. As long as you don't need 8K video, which is what the R5 offers, I find that the 6K RAW is fantastic. I usually shoot 4K anyway, so this camera's fantastic for that. The stills are great. Again, it's a little bit of an image bump on the R6 in terms of megapixels. So I find that this camera is a really happy hybrid camera between photo and video that allows you to kind of shoot both of them very well, and feel confident in both the photo and the video that you're creating. So if you're a combined photo video shooter, this camera's great. So wedding photographers. So I'd say if you're a wedding photographer who's shooting a lot in like bad weather, rain, snow, ice, any of that kind of stuff, and or if you just need good battery life, this camera is fantastic for that. The weather sealing is definitely better than like the R6, the R5. The battery life's gonna be phenomenal, especially if you're kind of hiking and climbing a lot and you just wanna have the two different options for gripping the camera. The integrated battery grip is incredibly nice on this camera. So if that's your kind of workflow as a wedding photographer, this camera is great for that. So who is this camera not for? First off, wedding photographers. So if you're a wedding photographer and you're only shooting photos, I think the R3 is probably a little bit too much for you. Unless you're shooting elopements and you're going hiking and you're in bad weather and you need the weather sealing or you really need the battery life, I would point you towards the R6. Not even the R5, honestly. I feel like the R5 has a little bit too much resolution. You're gonna be taking up so much space in your memory cards and your hard drives with that camera. I feel like the R6 is a lot more of a happy medium there, where you're still getting a great amount of resolution in the camera, plenty for wedding images, for portraits, for that kind of stuff. You're getting an incredible autofocus system in a much smaller, much cheaper package, where you can buy two R6s for basically the price of the R3. For video only shooters, if you're only shooting video, this is a great video camera, but it's not a dedicated video camera. If you're looking for just video, look at some of the cinema cameras from Canon, look at the Reds, look at some of the Sony cameras. I feel like some of those cameras have better video only options. The R3 is a great video camera. It does a really, really good job, but it's not designed specifically for video. It's meant to be a hybrid camera. So if you're just shooting video, I'd probably look somewhere else. Landscape and studio photographers. If you're shooting landscapes, if you're shooting studio work, I would lean you towards the R5 versus the R3 or the R6 because of the resolution. If you're in an environment where you don't have to really worry about shooting a ton of images like you would for a wedding, you want the resolution. You want all of that detail. And so picking a camera like the R3 is probably a little bit overkill for your needs when you can spend less money, get more resolution on the R5. That'd be the Canon camera to get. But again, there's some other incredibly great high resolution photo cameras out there that would be great for landscapes and for studio work. And finally, hobbyists. Unless you just have a ton of money, I'm gonna drop over $6,000 on a camera, this is probably not the camera for you. Again, I think the R6 is kind of a great, well-rounded, all-around camera in the Canon lineup. If you have the money, the R5 is a great camera as well, just for some travel stuff. You get some great resolution out of that. But again, I think that's a little bit overkill. And if the R5 is overkill, the R3 definitely is overkill. It's a great camera. I'm definitely not gonna say it's not for you, but I think the R6 or even a different camera manufacturer could be better if you're just shooting photos just for the fun of it, for some travel work, some family stuff, that kind of thing. I think there's other better cameras suited for that kind of a workflow rather than pointing you towards the R3. So anyway, that's my honest thoughts on the Canon R3. Honestly, I love this camera. It's been an integral part of my workflow for the last 6 or so months now. I'm gonna be shooting all the rest of my work for 2022 and probably well beyond on this camera. It's been great. Hopefully this video's been helpful. If it has, drop a like and feel free to subscribe to see more content from me every week. I'll see you back here next week. Peace.